Good evening. If I could please have your attention. My name is Johnny Burtka, and I'm the Executive Director of the American Conservative. I'd like to welcome you here tonight to our conversation on cronyism in Anaheim. And before we get started with this exciting discussion, I'd like to extend a few thank yous. First and foremost to Howard and Roberta Amundsen of Fieldstead and Company for their generous support of this evening. Let's give Howard and Roberta a warm welcome. And also to our speakers tonight, especially to Mayor Tait, who's here, as well as to my colleague Emil Doak for planning the logistics of the event. Thanks to each of you, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. So the mission of the American Conservative is to promote a Main Street conservatism that opposes unchecked power in government and business, promotes the flourishing of families and communities through vibrant markets and free people, and embraces realism and restraint in foreign affairs based on America's vital national interests. We accomplish this goal through our print and web publication, which you can find at theamericanconservative.com, through our internship program for young journalists in Washington, D.C., through briefings for congressmen and congressional staff on Capitol Hill, as well as through conferences, lectures, and panel discussions like you're participating in this evening. For those of you who don't know, the American Conservative was founded in 2002 on the eve of the war in Iraq by three courageous men, Pat Buchanan, Scott McConnell, and Taki Theodorakopoulos. It's a tricky Greek name. These three men believed that conservatism had lost its way and wanted to do something about it. So they founded a print magazine in October of 2002. And if you were to go back and open up this issue, which is actually our very first issue that we'd ever printed, and open up to the first article, you would find a bold assertion: we will be different. Many voices will appear in the pages of the American Conservative, often in disagreement with one another. We are, of course, in considerable part Buchananite, well-disposed to the web of ideas that drew millions of voters during 3 Buchanan presidential bids. But our mission is broader: to reignite the conversation that conservatives ought to have engaged in since the end of the Cold War, but did not. So what are some of those conversations and ideas that have animated the way that we think about the world at the American Conservative? Well, first and foremost, we believe that our foreign policy, our immigration policy, and our trade policy should serve the national interest by promoting the flourishing, the safety, and the happiness of American citizens, especially those in the middle and working classes. We believe in the vigorous protection of civil liberties, the defense of our American and Western heritage, city planning and architecture that promotes both human and economic flourishing, and taking a vigorous stand against the crony capitalism, which erodes trust in our civic institutions, erects economic barriers for entrepreneurs. Excuse me, I had one more point. You get the general gist of it. There's a lot wrong with crony. It's really that issue of cronyism that brings us here tonight, that unites each and every one of us. And normally when I kick off our annual conference in Washington, D.C., I say something to the effect of, there's perhaps no topic more ignored than that of crony capitalism. And in Washington, that's certainly true, because you pretty much have to be a crony capitalist to pay your rent each month in Washington, D.C. It's in fact so ubiquitous that people on the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans, simply choose to ignore it and get on with their daily business. But here in the city of Anaheim, it's a different story, and more attention has been paid to this issue than perhaps any other city in the country. So what I'm really excited about is for us to get to take a look at this issue of cronyism through the lens of some of the other important topics that we focus on at the American Conservative. So we'll kick it off, and Robert Mary, a presidential historian, is going to set the historic stage and talk to us about how the battles that Tom is facing here in Anaheim are actually not rare throughout American history, but there's a tradition of Americans going all the way back to the days of Andrew Jackson, standing up to cronyism on behalf of the American people. We'll get to hear from Chuck Marohn with Strong Towns. Chuck is basically a modern-day Alexis de Tocqueville. He travels America from city to city, meeting with business leaders, civic leaders, asking questions, finding out what works and what doesn't work when trying to establish an economically vibrant community. And then, of course, we'll hear from your mayor about his experiences here in Anaheim and why the issue of cronyism is important to him and why it should be important to you all as citizens of Anaheim and as Americans. So without further ado, I am going to briefly read the bios of our speakers tonight so that you can have a little sense of their background, and then I will turn things over to Robert Mary. Bob Mary is a longtime Washington journalist and publishing executive. He spent 12 years as a political reporter for the Wall Street Journal and 22 as an executive at Congressional Quarterly, including 12 years as CEO. After CQ was sold to The Economist of London, he served as editor of the National Interest before retiring to Washington State to write books. He was lured from retirement in 2016 to become the editor of the American Conservative, a position he held until resuming his retirement in June of 2018. Mary has produced 5 volumes on American history and foreign policy, including the most recent, President McKinley, Architect of the American Century. Chuck Marohn is the founder and president of Strong Towns, an organization leading a national movement to rethink how our cities are built. Marohn saw the need for strong towns while working as a professional engineer in the state of Minnesota and as a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He has presented strong town concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America, and in 2017 was named one of the 10 most influential urbanists by Planet Zen. Marohn and his wife live in their hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota. And Mayor Tom Tait is serving his second term as mayor of Anaheim, having been first elected in 2010. Mayor Tait ran on a platform of bringing the values of freedom and kindness to the culture of the city while upholding fiscal responsibility, public safety, and civic upkeep. In 2011, Tait formed a regulatory relief task force to review and eliminate regulatory burdens on existing and prospective businesses in Anaheim, resulting in more freedom for people to achieve their dreams. Aside from his duties as mayor, Tait is CEO of Tait & Associates, a civil engineering firm, and Tait Environmental Services, an environmental consulting company. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to Robert Mary.
Thank you, Johnny. Johnny indicated I have spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., about 40 years, until I managed to escape, largely because I didn't want to die of cold fever. But I think I figured out the town's motto, which is where there's smoke, there's mirrors. But I will say that when it comes to one thing, there's no smoke and mirrors. It's very clear. That is that if anybody or any organization or any company can maneuver to get special favors, special emoluments from the federal government, they'll do it. And that's crony capitalism. Now, that scourge of crony capitalism goes back to the beginning of the Republic, but we've also had people from the beginning of the Republic who fought very, very hard to prevent that from taking hold. Ultimately, over the course of 230 years, it didn't succeed all that well, but they did pretty well in the early years, largely owing to one particular figure, Andrew Jackson, the populist from the frontier of Tennessee. Now, Jackson was what we call a conservative populist. And what do I mean by that? There were several elements to the definition. There was a very significant aversion to bigness in all of its manifestations, including big government. Now, liberal populists don't care about the problem of big government because they want to enlist big government in their other populist aims against the rich or wealthy or big corporations. Secondly, there's a faith in the part of conservative populists, Ronald Reagan was one, in the capacity of ordinary folks to understand and act upon their own interests. Again, liberal populists don't feel that way. They think that the elites are in good position to determine the interests of ordinary Americans. And finally, there's a natural aversion among conservative populists to entrenched elites because there's a concern, and Andrew Jackson shared this concern, that those elites, if they have entrenched power, will always abuse it. But conservative populists don't hate the rich, unlike the liberal populists. And that will become clear as I talk a little bit about Andy Jackson. There's no desire on the part of conservative populists to bring about economic outcomes with governmental power. Now, all this was reflected in two Jacksonian actions during his presidency. He was elected in 1828, served two terms. And these two Jacksonian vetoes of major legislation demonstrated conservative populism, concern about crony capitalism, of course there was no such term in those days, his willingness to take tough stand even against just the prospect of what we today understand crony capitalism. So the first veto was in a road bill, the Maysville Road in May of 1830. Congress appropriated money to continue the American road that gone through several states, and it was going to extend to Maysville, Kentucky, to Lexington, Kentucky. This was all part of the public works concept of Henry Clay. Henry Clay was Jackson's great rival, and he believed that the federal government should pull together significant power to pull America up to greatness from above. And the Jacksonians believed that American people would push America to greatness from below. So this Maysville Road bill was not crony capitalism per se, but Jackson had an objection to it because he felt that federal involvement in an intrastate public works project gave the feds too much power and cost too much money at a time when the federal government had a national debt. Can you imagine that? Being concerned about the national debt? Jackson actually was the first president to actually eliminate the U.S. national debt. I might note that he was also the last president to eliminate the national debt. And he understood the threat that this posed in terms of fostering crony capitalism, which was reflected in his language on this particular veto. And I want to quote rather extensively from it. He said, "People have a right to expect a prudent, quote, prudent system of expenditure, end quote, that would allow the government to, quote again, pay the debts of the Union and authorize the reduction of every tax to as low a point as our national safety and independence will allow." But he added, if the government amassed the kind of power implied by the road project, it would lead inevitably to, quote, a corrupting influence upon the election by giving people a sense that their vote could purchase beneficial government actions to make navigable their neighboring creek or river, bring commerce to their doors, and increase the value of their property. And he suggested that this would be fatal to just legislation, put it, and the purity of public men. Now, what was he saying here? He was saying that if government was to start meddling in all these local matters, pretty soon people would start maneuvering for special favor. So he knew exactly what could happen, and that what could happen was crony capitalism. That language was echoed in his famous veto message that attended his famous veto of the Second Bank of the United States. This great political battle. I wish I had time to go into it further, but I don't. But suffice it to say that the bank was a public-private institution to maintain currency stability, a very legitimate federal need, and also to provide a place to park federal funds, also necessary. But Jackson felt that too much power had been invested in that bank. Now, Henry Clay, his great rival, thought that if he vetoed this bank bill, this reauthorization of the bank, he would lose Pennsylvania, because Philadelphia was the nation's financial center. If he lost Pennsylvania, he would lose the election to Henry Clay, who planned to run against him. But in his veto message, Jackson portrayed this government-sponsored monopoly as a threat to freedom. And he said that it employed the money of taxpayers to enhance the power, privileges, and wealth of a few Americans and foreigners, because there were a lot of shareholders that were foreigners. So if the government is to grant such amenities, he added, quote, let them not be bestowed on the subjects of a foreign government, nor upon a designated and favored clan of men in our own country. Rather, it should be confined, he said, to our own fellow citizens, and let each in turn enjoy an opportunity to profit by our bounty. Then he made clear that he was not interested in any leveling or redistribution of resources among citizens. Here's what he said, some of my favorite words in American political history. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talents, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions. In the full enjoyment of the gifts of heaven and the fruits of superior industry, economy, and virtue, every man is equally entitled to protection by law. In other words, he said that the government had a positive obligation to protect the wealth and their wealth from the politics of envy, or the forces that want to come and redistribute that wealth. And then he added, but when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society, the farmers, mechanics, laborers, who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves, have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. And rising to eloquence, he said that government should continue to confine itself to equal protection, and its heaven does its rains, shower its favors alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor. With such a government, there would be no prospect for crony capitalism, as long as government showers its favors as the heaven does the rain. And so with Jackson, we had a man who understood human nature, which meant that he understood the potential threat that crony capitalism posed to the public. So I feel that he was quite a heroic figure in many, many ways, and in this one in particular, so I thought I wanted to share that. And I think we'll turn it over to Chuck now, who will talk about some of his experiences traveling the country in search of sound judgment in city planning.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. It's very nice to be here. I thank the American Conservative for the invitation. I do a lot of traveling, and I am married. I have 2 daughters. One of the deals that I have with my family is that I don't travel during the summer. I travel during the school year, but during the summer I'm home trying to be dad. When this invitation came up, I said, I'm sorry, I can't. I can't make it. It's during summer. School starts next week. And then I was able to bribe my daughter, Chloe, with a day at Disneyland. I said, well, how about we do this? So I want to thank Chloe, too, before I get started, sitting in front, so that I can be here tonight. Thank you. We may have some fireworks yet tonight. I thought about this issue a lot, because I've never actually written about the issue of crony capitalism, per se. I've kind of danced around it in many different ways. I've never really written specifically about it, so I spent a lot of time in preparation for this, thinking about it. And by the way, Johnny, when you introduced this tonight, you said a discussion of crony capitalism in Anaheim. And I think it was a discussion in Anaheim about crony capitalism, right? At least that's how I've approached it. So let's break this up into two words, because I think the two different things, looking at them separately, kind of illuminates, for me, the central problem. The first one is the cronyism part of it. And I'm going to put forth tonight, just from my vantage point, that cronyism is as human as any other thing that we have. It is kind of innate to us, to who we are. We can go back and we can look at, the writings of Cicero or Cato talking about, the late Roman Republic. We can read the Bible and writing, the stories of Jesus and the Pharisees and the scribes. And what you see recurring throughout all of human history is a certain amount of, we work together. And whenever we work together as teams, we, as humans, we can say this is a flaw or this is an innate feature of who we are. We tend to develop favorites, right? We tend to develop connections. We tend to develop relationships. I once read a journalist who had written a statement about basically like bribery and influence. And he said, it's very easy if someone came into my office running a newspaper, as a publisher of a newspaper, and said, yeah, I would like to give you $10,000 to write an article about, positive about me, or I'm going to give you money to suppress this story. It's very easy to say no to. There's a very clear, ethical line, and I would have no problem saying no to that. The harder one, the much harder one, is when the person that I'm friends with comes to me and says, could you spike that story? Or the person who I'm connected to in some way, a family member comes in and says, could you, not run that or spin this in a certain way or do that? That's harder. And why is that harder? It's harder because the ethical obligations run in different ways, right? Do I have an obligation to you as a friend, as a colleague, as a family member? Yes, I do. Does that sometimes run counter to my obligation to my business, my community, the work? Yeah, there's sometimes conflict there, and that's a difficult one to work with. I think that stepping back and acknowledging that cronyism, which I will say is the effect of people showing favoritism towards other people or other entities or other groups, is as natural and human as just about anything. We could say it's not healthy, we could say it's not bad, but what I'm saying is that if we don't acknowledge that it exists and exists innately in all of us, we're denying something fundamental. Let me switch and talk a little bit about capitalism, because I think this is where these two things kind of rub up against each other and become very inflamed in our current system. We spend a lot of time at Strong Towns dealing with the impacts of our development of the post-World War II way of building this country. And there's a couple of things that I want to kind of point out to make this point in a succinct way. When we finished World War II, there was a very real fear among economists that our economy was just going to slide right back into depression. We had been through a decade of hardship. We had had the war, which I don't think anybody looked at as the good time for here again. But if you're a macroeconomist, you looked at it and we've got full employment now, we've got high production, we don't have problems with depression, but nothing has really changed. And when we demobilize this military and bring everybody back, what's going to keep us from sliding right back into depression? At the same time, and we can look at the whole kind of Keynesian revolution in economics, there was a very real sense that we could, as a country, as a nation, as really the last nation standing in this horrific global war, the last nation that was untouched at home, huge industrial capacity. We didn't wipe out every 20, late teen, early 20-year-old in our population. There was this idea that we could, once and for all, solve the age-old problem of humanity. The problem that got us out of being hunter-gatherers, the problem that got us into cities, the problem that we have been trying to solve for thousands and thousands of years. And that problem is this: how do you, on food for one person, feed 3 people? How do you split a loaf of bread between 3 hungry people? How do you split a meal between 3 hungry people? That is the essential problem that humans have been trying to solve for all of human history. And the way we figured out that we could solve it today is to create 2 more loaves of bread. If we could grow our economy, we could have robust growth. If we could create an economy that expanded the pie endlessly, we could take and feed those other people. And oh, by the way, everybody else would have a little too. Here's the remarkable thing. It worked, didn't it? It worked. And in a short period of time, we can look and we see, and we nostalgize today that post-World War II era, the 50s and the 60s, the Ozzie and Harriet kind of family, the idea of a blue-collar family being able to have one wage earner to support everything. When we look at cities and communities, my area of expertise, what we see is that this was the time of huge amounts of capital investment, lots of growth, lots of just an emergent American prosperity. We nostalgize this era as like the dream of America. In fact, if you go back to the last presidential election, we had 2 70-year-old candidates looking back at the greatest time in their path, explaining to us how they were going to make that happen today. One vision was blue-collar jobs, Ozzie and Harriet families. The other vision was, a federal government that had the money to expand Social Security and Medicaid. They were both talking about the same period of time. It's a period of time that at Strong Town we call the illusion of wealth. And I want to explain that concept in a way that I've had before, but I'm going to do it a little bit different way tonight because I need to drive the point home quickly. If you look at the economics of a nation and a state, it's very, very different than the economics of a city. When you look at an event like Hurricane Katrina came in and devastated a community, absolutely devastated the city of New Orleans, along with a bunch of other communities. But let's focus on New Orleans. If you remember back, what happened after Hurricane Katrina from a national economic perspective? Well, we had a bump in GDP. We had a lower in unemployment. Home Depot stock, which I actually owned at the time, went way, way up. This was a great, if you are a macroeconomist who cares nothing about humans, who does not do anything but look at spreadsheets, Hurricane Katrina was a gift from God. It solved all the macroeconomic problems for a very short period of time. It allowed our economy to grow. We all of a sudden had this huge boost in GDP. If you were the city of New Orleans, and more importantly, if you were the neighborhoods in New Orleans, what did you experience? A destruction overnight of decades and decades of accumulated wealth. When we look at cities, cities are not, we often are forced to, but cities do not function well when they focus on GDP growth and jobs and unemployment. When cities build wealth that can be passed on, wealth that is attained, wealth that is built within a neighborhood, within a block, within a community, that can be passed on generation to generation, that builds over time. That's a strong, healthy place. And so what we did after World War II is we created a system that was centered around maximizing variables at the federal and state level. How do we maximize GDP year after year? How do we maximize employment year after year? And what we did is we traded the wealth and stability of our communities for that short-term macroeconomic gain. Let me walk you through the mechanism at the local level. If I go out and build, let's start with the traditional city. And if you've ever been to Europe, you can think of a European city, because Europe didn't do this to their cities after World War II. You can think about a modern European city, or you can think about an American city prior to the Great Depression. What you had in those cities was basically a pocket, an accumulation of wealth in a place. This might have been a very large place like a New York City. It might have been a very small place like Anaheim at the time. But what you had was people who had built incrementally and accumulated wealth within that place. The upside of that kind of an arrangement was that as you built incrementally, what you had was very strong, very resilient, very adaptable. There was wealth in that place that essentially could sustain that place over a prolonged period of time. This is what we saw during the Great Depression. But the tyranny of a place like that is that when you accumulate wealth kind of slowly and incrementally in a place like that, you don't have a lot of turnover of that wealth. You can think of the daddy Warbucks who owns the bank and the big place downtown, all the big stores. The tyranny of a place like that is that if you're poor, if you don't have money, if you want to get started, you're forced to go out to the edge. The stuff in the middle of town is really expensive. The homes are expensive, buildings are expensive, and that's because the land is expensive. But that expensive land was a part of the deal. That's where you're building the wealth. When we started building with the automobile, what we did very successfully is we attacked that tyranny of that wealth accumulation. For those of you that had geometry, the area of a circle, pi r squared, when you run a highway through a city out to the edge, open up all that land, all of a sudden you have a geometrically huge amount of area that's now able to be developed. It's not just within walking distance of the downtown or walking distance of your neighborhood center that now has wealth. You've opened up this whole place for development. Think of your basic Econ 101, supply and demand. When you dramatically increase the supply, what happens to the price? It goes to zero. So what we did is we systematically devalued our cities as a way to create very cheap land for quick development. That was the mechanism that we used after World War II to give middle-class families homes, give everybody their own acre, create an ownership society, and essentially grow like gangbusters. We killed the price of land. When you're a city, this has an unintended consequence. The first unintended consequence is that it destroyed our center of our communities. We saw that. We went decades of malaise in the center of our communities where they lost value, and you had huge places built of marble and brick and just gorgeous buildings that were completely walked away from because the value in the underlying land went to nothing, and the energy went somewhere else. You also saw, and this is the issue we're starting to deal with now in a very acute way, is that as cities grew in this pattern, they took on enormous liabilities. The reason why that wealth was so important is because that wealth is what paid to maintain the street and maintain the sidewalk and maintain the pipe. And now when you look at, especially here in California, these cities that are spread out over these huge amounts of area, without land values continually rising, without a renewal mechanism, what you have is you have an enormous amount of liability and not enough wealth, not enough real wealth to maintain. So what have we done? And this is where I think the capitalism part needs a real close examination. Because in my mind, what is capitalism? Capitalism is the ability of my daughter Chloe to have a college savings fund from when she's a little kid and put, birthday money in it and money from odd jobs in it and have it grow over time. And it's just a tiny little savings account, right? But what should happen? It should draw interest. And that interest should be drawn because the bank is taking that capital from not only her, but from you and you and you and all of you, and investing it in places where it's going to get a higher return. And someone's going to come into the bank and say, I want to get that money out because I'm going to go spend it on something that has value, creates value. It's a mechanism to essentially take idle capital and use it more effectively, to build wealth and to grow the pie. How much does my daughter get on her savings account today? Nothing, right? Nothing. Zero. We get the statement from the bank quarterly, and it shows 3 cents of interest, right? How much, when we look at, I've been following the McDonald's Corporation. We don't even have to get that obscure. Look at Apple. We're told continuously that Apple is sitting on a hoard of cash, right? $140 billion. What you're not told is that Apple has $120 billion of debt. Why do they have so much debt? Because we're paying them to borrow money. We got to the point in our economic system where we needed growth so bad in a macro sense. We needed growth so bad that we changed what it meant to have a capitalist system. I don't know what the system we have today is. I can't really explain it. I've heard it described as debtism. I've heard it described as centralized capitalism or state capitalism. But it certainly is not the kind of economic system that I have come to understand and know as the ability of someone to save and have that savings fluctuate with demand. There's not enough savings, so interest rates go up. There's too much savings, interest rates go down. More people want to borrow, so interest rates go up. Fewer people want to borrow, interest rates go down. We don't have that kind of system today. It doesn't work that way. So what do we have? I don't know. But it has one characteristic that intersects with this cronyism in a huge way. It is centralized. And every time we run into a problem with our economy, our reaction is to centralize it further, to try to make it more efficient, to try to get a little bit more out of what we're doing. Whether that is in the Clinton administration, we'll get rid of those old rules on banks and let them consolidate and expand. We saw this in the George W. Bush administration, in the Obama administration. The bipartisan reaction to economic stress is further consolidation and efficiency. And this is where I'm going to go back to my original concept of cronyism. If you were Daddy Warbucks in your town, or whatever, the person who owned the rich land in the center of town, there was a certain, I'm just going to call social or community pressure for you to act in a certain way. And you might have been a jerk, and I'm sure people in your community hated you because you lorded your money over them, and you were, whatever. But you know what you also did? You also went to the same church as them. You also sent your kids to the same school as them. You also had to walk down the same street. You had to shop at the same stores. You had to interact with them. And so, yeah, your altruism might be to, put a fountain in the center of the park and have it named after you. Your way of showcasing your wealth, might have been to start a library in the center of town. That might have been, your way of doing whatever it was. That's a heck of a lot different than, I've got to have the second yacht or, be part of a jet pool, private jet pool. Or, we see all the excesses that go along with being disconnected from community. There's an adage that I've grown up with that I've kind of kept in the back of my brain as, someone who grew up on a farm in central Minnesota and now finds himself in a very kind of different place in life than any of my ancestors prior. I read once that if you want to feel poor, hang out with rich people. And if you want to feel rich, hang out with poor people. And I think what has happened to the mixing of cronyism and capitalism is that our society has become centralized, hyper-efficient, and in a word, like stratified, so that we don't rub up against each other across classes. People who are ultra-wealthy tend to be with people who are ultra-wealthy. People who are very poor tend to be with people who are very poor. I'm not saying that that didn't happen in the past, but it didn't happen in the isolating way that it does today. Today, it's actually so crazy that if you just look at a zoning standpoint, We have said, this zone is R1. That's single-family homes. This zone is R2. That's slightly bigger single-family homes. You can't have a duplex in the same neighborhood as a single-family home, and by God, you can't have that anywhere near a 4-unit or a 6-unit or an apartment building, because that would be horrible. If you do, you've got to have berms and fences and all kinds of things to keep those separate from each other. I think what we're suffering from is not a problem with cronyism, but a problem with the way we've done capitalism. And I feel like the solution to the problem is to find ways to relocalize our economy so that the people with capital know the people doing it.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck. Now, Tom Tait, right here in Anaheim, recently took on the mouse. This was no ordinary mouse. Tell us about that, Tom.
Right to the heart of it. First of all, Bob, I want to thank you for the invite here. Thank you for coming to our city. Chuck, I've certainly read your writings before, as do most mayors. You're involved with U.S. conference mayors. Your reviews are well read by mayors throughout the country and very well respected. So welcome here to our city. It is a wonderful city. About 360,000 people, one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the United States. There's an article years ago from USA Today called Anaheim, one of the new Brooklyns, because of this wonderful ethnic diversity that we have, and probably 45% immigrant, which is very interesting. I know the Kauffman Foundation has done studies about if you want growth and prosperity in your city, the number one thing that you could have that would predict that is a large immigrant population. The thing that doesn't work are government incentives for large businesses, which is what Anaheim has done. I first got involved actually as an elected official. I actually got appointed as an elected official back in 1994, and I think it was my second meeting we had, and this issue came up. And I tell you the truth, before that, I really hadn't thought about cronyism or government subsidies or things like that. I really thought being on the council was going to be more of a kind of a business type thing where I work to drive efficiencies, the amount of money we have, get the most services we could out of that. But my second meeting, here this issue comes forth, and it's all been negotiated and worked out for months in advance before I was there. And it was with this company called Fry's Electronics. You might know Fry's out there off the 91 freeway, a massive electronics superstore. And they had worked a deal with the city where they would get, well, it was like the tax rebate, but it actually was a $5 million economic incentive to build there, and it would be paid out of the taxes. So basically, the taxes that they paid in California, the cities get 1 penny of the tax. It's about 9%, roughly about 9% sales tax, of which the cities get 1 cent of that. And the deal was that 1/2 of that cent that we get was going to go back to Fry's. But they couldn't do that because you can't give a tax rebate in California, because the tax is actually paid by the person buying the goods. So it had to be an economic assistance, and it was a contract. And it was a contract for tenant improvements for their building, for $5 million. There's a lot of money. So I remember looking at that, I said, why would Fry's, this giant company with this giant superstore, need $5 million of our money for tenant improvements? And I thought, well, the other big electronics store in town was CompUSA, not far from here. It was built in a redevelopment project that actually got government subsidy before that. How's it going to be fair to them? So Prize gets built. I voted against it right off the 4-1. There's a 4-1 vote. Prize gets built, and of course, CompUSA, the smaller electronics superstore, went out of business eventually. But then I thought, before CompUSA, there had to be people buying electronics in Anaheim, and there were probably folks that were involved in the community, probably someone who started a business, probably a family business, probably participated in their charities, probably kids went to our schools, all those things. So that round got put out by the first round of economic assistance or cronyism at the CompUSA. So they were long gone because I actually didn't even know of any small electronics store at that time. And then CompUSA got eaten by Verizon Electronics. And so really, is Anaheim any better off after that whole thing? And I would say definitely not. Actually much worse off. Folks could come in from around the area and buy cheaper electronics, I suppose, because they have a equivalent to half-cent break, as if Verizon needed the break. They had great buying power. They spread it out over a large area. So anyway, throughout the years, other issues came up, and I had really, I voted against most of them. A few of them I voted for, because I guess they made sense at the time. I look back, and they're mistakes. But then it really came to a crescendo the last 3-4 years ago. And these deals were so outrageously bad that it actually created quite a fissure in our city, and with great, divisiveness because of probably because of the vastness of these. And there were basically, the first one was in 2015, and it was to the Disney Corporation, and it was a 45-year exemption from any taxation on their gates. So, Chuck, if you went to Disneyland today, and Chloe, you pay whatever ticket price it is, there's zero tax paid on that. And Disney got a guarantee that even if the people of Anaheim, because in California, the only way you can raise a tax is a vote of the people. So in 20 years, if the people of Anaheim voted for a tax on entertainment, baseball, arena, theaters, and Disney, or parking or things like that, then what would happen was that the person would be charged a tax at the gate. Disney would collect it, pay it to the city or any other entity, and then the city, that agreement said that the city will write Disney a check back for that amount. So people find, that one company had an exclusion from any taxes, where every other company and every other person, all 360,000 of us, had no exclusion. So that just rubbed people the wrong way. By the way, the Disney story has a very good ending, and because it just happened this week, so I'll get to that. A year later, anyway, I fought that deal, but lost. A year later, there was, let me go back, even before that deal, there was a hotel developer, this is in 2012, who wanted to build a luxury hotel. And he had bought his land in 2006 in the resort district. And anyone who bought land in 2006 lost, probably paid way too high right before the recession. So this developer came with hiring certain lobbyists, came to the city and said, you know what, I can't build that luxury hotel here. I need economic assistance. I need to basically get all the tax I paid for 20 years, I need to get it back. And the city council agreed to that, and that drove a big wedge, $158 million. Normally, what would happen if people bought property in 2006, recession hits, property drops down, like everybody else. He probably loses the property, loses the investment. But instead, the city really, in effect, bailed him out and brought it back up. So That was the first, but that really kind of blew apart the city council, that deal. And it was a 3-2 vote, and it's been, we've been divided on that issue of cronyism ever since. The next one was the Angel Stadium. We have a stadium here owned by the people of Anaheim, plus 150 acres of prime real estate, where three freeways come together in Southern California. The property in the stadium are probably worth over $1 billion. Again, hiring certain lobbyists. The owner of the Angels cut a preliminary deal that the council voted on, where the city would give the owner, not even the baseball team, but the owner, a long-term lease, 66 years, for $1 a year for that $1 billion piece of property. Fortunately, the people in the city saw that deal and thought, that's the largest real estate asset the city owns, and the council, over 3-day notice, over Labor Day weekend, cut that deal. So that drove this issue even further. In 2016, after the initial hotel deal, the city council said, boy, we can do this even more. And they did it for another 2 developers, one being Disney, to the tune of about $550 million. Disney, $267 million. So to give you an idea how much, over 20 years, to give you an idea how much this is, our city has a general fund budget of $400 million. We pay about $100 million a year back to our district. So really, we spend about $300 million. And you think these developers are worth more than the city of Anaheim. We have a. If you look at our balance sheet, we have it's called our net position. These are our unencumbered assets plus our liabilities. Our net position is minus about $400 million. So when you hear about an economic assistance agreement between the city of Anaheim and a large Chinese corporation worth, I don't know how much, or Disneyland worth, on this balance sheet, $50 billion. And you say, boy, there's an economic assistance between these 2 major corporations and this host city. Well, that's great, but then you find out the money is going from the city to the large corporations. So the people of Anaheim, 90% of the kids in the Anaheim City School District qualify for federal free lunch. We need every single penny we could get, and then some, to provide services. That's what caused this angst, and we've been fighting about it on the city council, in the community, ever since, and it's caused great discord and lack of unity. So just this past week, this is so interesting that I'm here talking about this today. Just this past week, the president of Disney came into my office and with her general counsel with a piece of paper and said, you know what, we think these agreements are so toxic. That was my word, but that's essentially what the letter said. That is creating such discourse in our city that we think it's important that we work together, and we want to cancel both those agreements, 45-year tax exemption and the $260 million economic incentive agreement. I give them great credit for doing that. Yeah. There was, there are other reasons, there are other factors at play that there's an initiative out there. The workers at Disneyland have said, if you're going to get a big tax incentive, if you're a developer, who gets one of these big tax incentives from the city, then you ought to pay us the living wage, starting at 15, going to 18 and beyond. So there's that pressure going on right now that will actually not apply to Disney anymore because they aren't taking these incentives, but will apply to those other developers that are taking the incentive. But I truly believe, Disney, the leadership there said, you know, the long-term health of our company in Disneyland, it has to have it needs to have a relationship with its city where we can all prosper together. We need to be working together, and this fighting is a bad thing. So anyway, there's a happy ending on that. We still have about $450 million of economic incentive to these other hotel developers, which I don't know quite how we're going to pay for that. On top of pension liability, unfunded pension liability. That's all going to come to roost here in the future. But there's, it bothers me, this idea of cronyism, and you think about, I'll tell you what I think about, it's really helpful. So we have this stadium, and it seats about 40,000 people. And I think about as mayor, when I make decisions, and it's, there's all sorts of special interests that decisions come up. And I think, okay, what's in the common good, and what's in the best interest of the people of Anaheim? And Chuck, you talked about the friendship thing, and that's so much a part of it. That's so much a part of it, and it is human nature. And I don't, it's, people want to help their friends, and they want to help their supporters, but it's something they have to fight against. And the way I fight against it is I think about standing on the pitcher's mound at Angel Stadium and looking at 35,000 people, and I times that by 10. And those people don't know who their mayor is, most of them, some do. But they know they have a mayor who's supposed to be looking out for their best interest. And so I actually think about how would I explain standing on that pitcher's mound to all those people how I voted on that deal. And if I could explain it, and I could feel good about explaining it to them, then I think it's a good deal for the people. If I can't, I ought not do it. So I think it's just it's a kind of simple thing like that. You're mentioning the founding fathers, and I'm like, you know more in your tiny figure about the founding fathers than I do. But I know when this country was set up, it was set up on a concept of liberty and virtue. That you have to have an underlying virtue for freedom to work. So I ran on a platform of kindness and freedom. And kindness is really another way for saying virtue. I mean, where all the virtues really come together for kindness, that's the action word for virtue. When you run on a platform of kindness, it's sort of like I've got a friend who says, when you buy a red car, you notice all the other red cars out there, right? It's awareness of it. Well, when you run on a platform of kindness, you notice the tremendous kindness going on in the city of Anaheim. And it's all over the place, in all the neighborhoods. And it's really what makes this whole thing work. And when you start seeing that kindness, it's what brings people together and builds that social infrastructure, social capital, as the academics call it. And when you do that, it brings you closer to the people. And I think that's kind of, so, early on, the cronyism, I didn't really think that much about it. I just kind of thought about it from an efficiency and fairness point of view. But after I ran as mayor on the platform of kindness, you look at the people differently, and you think of them as family, and actually there's love involved, and then you start thinking about, how does this help them? How do we help these wonderful people who are so kind in our city? And typically, you want to get as many services as you can do. I talked about public safety and civic upkeep. That's a trade-off. You're not delivering, I wrote that down, you said a prudent system of expenditures, that Andrew Jackson talked about. You don't have a prudent system of expenditures where you get the most bang for your buck for your taxpayer dollars to drive services, and many of those services are life and death type services. Police, public safety, fire protection. If you're not getting everything you can for that, which is our real reason, local government is really here to deliver public services in an efficient way. If you don't do that, and if you're getting involved in other things, giving away to hotels or stadiums and things like that, you're taking away from something else. And what you're taking away is that something else is essential for society. So it's a big topic to me, but it's really great that you're here this week because after a long time, there's been some really great news this week. And I'm hoping that what Disney has done, can be an example to other corporations that maybe are taking this crony, or pushing studies for these crony deals that, you know what, in the long term, not good. And maybe it's in their best interest to have a healthy, vibrant little city. I think that's recently.
I've got a question. Could I ask? Because it's very interesting to me as I hear you tell the story of the Anaheim Angels, and then also of the Disney Corporation. You were going to say what?
Thanks for saying Anaheim Angels.
I did. I respect that. I know they have branded it slightly differently, but I actually have an Angels jersey at home. It's Anaheim Angels. So let's a lot of times when we're talking about tax subsidies, and if you're the Angels and you come here and say, we need to give us the subsidy or we're going to go somewhere else. But if you're the Disney Corporation, it's not like they're going to relocate Disneyland. At least I didn't see that like on the table. What is, you mentioned lobbyists, and I kind of took that from your talk, like there's a guy in a suit that comes in who you don't really know, who, you know, what is the pressure that is being brought to bear from something like the Disney Corporation? Because it feels a little bit different than cronyism, as in, like, you know, you and I are buddies. I'm gonna get, or is it really that simple? Like, is this, you know, because the way you described it didn't seem like that to me.
Yeah, it's simple yet complicated, I suppose, in Anaheim. You've got, you have a super dominant corporation, and as of the last maybe few years, they've gotten very active politically with spending money in a local race. The last 2 cycles, they've spent over $1 billion.
So they're truly involved in the campaign side.
They're very involved in the campaign cycle. And I think that's, at some point when you get to be so large, that's probably a mistake. Because the people who they get elected, you're going to bring the criticism that they're basically in their pocket, whether they are or not. And the people that if the opponents get elected over that mountain of money, you're going to come out with some pretty angry folks and all their supporters, because that kind of money can do anything a campaign can possibly do. And the way that we've basically I'll call it the anti-subsidy majority that is now in power got elected was through a grassroots system of literally walking precincts, knocking on doors, outspent by a massive amount of money. I mean, and you would look at it and say, how can they possibly win? One great thing that happened in Anaheim that kind of changed that was 4 years ago, the people voted for district elections. So before that, it was an at-large system. And I used to think that made sense. It seemed pretty efficient. You wouldn't get the ward politics. But then if I started thinking about it more, if in an at-large system, a city like Anaheim, 20-some miles from end to end, you could be out in West Anaheim, and you could be either Mother Teresa or a scoundrel, and no one's going to know it in East Anaheim. So what happens is you go to certain people and say, certain groups of people, and in Anaheim it's been, you know, the Chamber of Commerce, Disney, and the public employee unions, they all kind of got on the same team. And if they back that candidate, you get elected. Just because, if you were a grassroots candidate, you wouldn't even stand a chance. In fact, I'd recommend not to bother. But now with district elections, 6 districts, 60,000 people, if you're Mother Teresa or a scoundrel, they're going to know it in that district. And so you can actually have a chance if you're very involved in the community, charities, things like that. You've got a fighting chance. And in fact, that's what's happened on a couple of these last races. So it's I think that was key, actually, to getting us where we are today, and with Disney taking the position they did. That was one of the things that that kind of did change the city. Will change it, and it gives me great optimism for the future. And that now it brings the government much closer to the people, much closer to the people, and it's a good thing. I don't even know if I answered your question there.
No, you did. It's just, it bewilders me because I've followed the Disney Corporation pretty closely. And one of the things that they've been doing the last few years is raising gate fees. And they're raising gate fees kind of in a supply-demand way to depress demand a little bit because they're actually at capacity many times. They don't have a demand problem. They're not struggling in any way. So what's the case for subsidy? That's the one that I've struggled with. Like, why would you just because you can? And that's the part that is kind of bewildering to me.
Well, if you think about it, if there's one place where you know, without a doubt, the hotel is going to just knock it out of the park.
Right.
There's a hotel on the Disney property where you have 25 million visitors come here. And the one place you can say, boy, why do they need a subsidy to build that? And the fact is they don't. They don't need a subsidy. But if you could ask for it and get it, or have the council, or if the council does a policy and take advantage of it, whatever the case, I suppose you could say, why wouldn't you? Because their duty is to their shareholders, right? But I don't think that's their only duty. And I think that's something that's maybe it's a broader subject. I think corporations have a broader duty than just maximizing shareholder wealth. And if you're a dominant or a company in a city, that you also have a duty to make sure that your host city and your community are thriving. Not legal, I wouldn't, but I think it's kind of it goes into that liberty and virtue idea.
It's an interesting concept. I'm sorry, am I walking over you again?
No.
It's because I get what we want is we want the Walt Disney Corporation to make an investment in a hotel if it's a good investment. We'd like them to have the access to the capital, and if it all makes sense, to make that investment. It's a very strange situation because if the Walt Disney Corporation or any corporation's duty is to maximize shareholder value, whose duty is it to maximize the shareholders of the community's value? And what that does is it kind of puts us at odds with the corporate players in our communities, and I don't think any of us are comfortable with that being the default case. So what is the pressure that's brought to bear that makes a corporation a responsible citizen within the community they're in? And I don't really have the answer.
Well, I think this gets to what you were saying about cronyism, the idea of cronies, friends, very much part of nature. That's going to also change. And you're absolutely right. It's the corporation's responsibility to maximize shareholder value. It's not the government's responsibility to maximize shareholder value. It is. So the community has to decide whether there's a trade-off there that's worth pursuing. That's the whole debate that's been going on. So I would go back to Andrew Jackson when he said, you do this, and pretty soon people are going to say, I can get the government, of course, to build this road to bring the creek or river to my door, or commerce to my door. And that's exactly what's happening. So where's the responsibility lie? It lies with the government. Where is the responsibility falling down? With the government. Not with Disney.
And this is where I see the fundamental problem, because what we have done, and Mary, you kind of alluded to it with the upcoming pension, we don't have to get into all that, but I think my proposition would be your city is not long-term financially solved, and I don't put that on your shoulders. I think that's a truism of all of California's cities, and really almost every city in North America. When you add up the promises we've made to provide service, to maintain infrastructure, to pay pensions, and you look at that and contrast it with the revenues we have coming in, if we were actually running cities like municipal corporations, we would all be insolvent. We would all be, forced into liquidation. If you think of it that way, the idea of making bad deals, to me, the motivation is a certain level of desperation to kind of make things work in the short term. And I feel like that's the fundamental problem with cities today, is you're kind of forced to, as a public official, do we, do something that's kind of a bad deal with the Anaheim Angels, or do we say no and put our foot down and then get nothing and have them go somewhere else? At least if we do the deal, it kind of helps things in the short term, even if it doesn't help us in the long term. And I feel that pressure for you. Like I empathize with that because I think that pressure is very real. But it's born of the fragileness of our city.
I know you want to respond to that, but I think I want to get the questions from the audience. So if anyone wants to raise a hand or raise the question, we're here to try to answer. I see a hand go up right over here, sir.
Now, you yourself have two companies and are the mayor. Is there any conflict of interest in the work that your own companies do with your job as mayor?
That's a good question. Yeah, I have actually, it's my family business. My father started an engineering business here in Anaheim in 1964, and now I've been CEO and part owner of it. If I did jobs in Anaheim that I voted on or that I participated on in any way, yes, that would be a problem. That'd be a conflict. So I don't. And you'll notice if I will actually abstain probably more than most elected officials I know, and I'll get up and actually leave the room if anything that involves anything that my company does comes across a desk or a decision. So, and I try to do is actually not just a legal conflict, but even if there's a perception. Because if there's a perception, if people lose faith, if they think that their mayor or any elected official or their city is corrupt, and they lose faith in the institution, and that erodes kind of everything. So it's a very good question, and I'm very cautious of that. I try very hard to even stay away from that perception, and I think I do a pretty good job of it. Thank you.
Let me comment on that. I'm sorry. Every time I talk, you bring your microphone up, and I feel like I'm jumping on.
That's why I do that so you will talk.
I want to point out one thing, and I respect your question, but I've been in lots of city council meetings, and I feel like oftentimes this kind of question comes up without either any historical context or without any understanding of what we're talking about. Cities have always been run by people who had vested interests in the welfare of that city and its future continuation and its prosperity. And I think oftentimes what we've reacted to this crony capitalism thing is by dealing with things that are simple. You run an engineering firm, is your engineering firm up for a contract with the city? Oh my gosh, there's some problem there. When in the context of like our cities, that's a toe stub versus, getting a leg amputated. And when we get the leg amputated, we seem to just be nonchalant about it. It's very easy, I think, to focus on these kind of things. And I think we forget the fact that cities are a collection of us. We all have an interest in this corporation in making it run and making it successful and making it prosperous. And I think if we somehow shun or exclude people who are vested that way in the community, we do ourselves like a huge disservice,
But let me add, but it's very important, I think, to be vigilant on keeping and watching elected officials, make sure that there's not an interest in a project, a financial interest, because, well, I mean, just to say it's just
you have to say
plain
that
wrong.
You have to say that because you're the mayor.
No, that's true.
But
no,
it's true.
It's very true.
I agree that it's true. But for someone from the outside, I'm saying, I think even in like a campaign season, we could obsess over those kind of things. And really, if you want someone who's not vested deeply in the community to be the person making decisions, you're asking for like the wrong person. You want someone who's committed to transparency and committed to, but you don't want someone who's not vested. Is the line I'm trying to draw.
Yeah, well, conflict. That's just obeying the law. I mean, it's not something to overlook. Anyway, one thing I wanted to bring up, and you gentlemen really didn't get a chance to get into it. Although Tom, you made mention of the word corrupt, talking about citizens believing that they're being able to believe that the government is not corrupt. We haven't talked about the causes of crony capitalism, which is the opportunity for corruption. And I look at the things that have happened in Anaheim, and I know that decisions have been made in violation of the Brown Act, behind the scenes. Deals have been worked out and offered to companies. Now, I don't blame companies for taking something that's offered to them. I probably would too if I was a corporation. But there is something that has gone on in this city and in many, many California cities under redevelopment, the old capital R, redevelopment, that cultivated a casual corruption about who got what, who hires which lobbyists, how things work out behind the scenes, and then it's sort of presented as a fait accompli. And the public looks at it very cynically, and rightly so. That's it. So Tom, I'd like to ask you, what do you think crony capitalism in Anaheim has done to and has been contributed to by our professional staff, people that were supposed to be working for the city, but who gave every indication, particularly on the Anaheim Stadium deal, of working for somebody else?
They, yeah, I think if you're a professional staff member and you have, it's probably, there's two ways to look at that job. And you can say, I'm going to give my professional opinion and let the chips fall as they may. And if the policy leaders who have the power to ultimately fire you don't like it, then they'll argue, and then you go along with it. Then once it's decided, then you move forward with whatever the decision is. Or you could say, this is what they want, and I'm just going to be for it, and I'm going to go along with it with my professional opinion, and recommend something that maybe you don't think you should. And I don't know what is in their hearts. But what we need, or when we hire professionals, is for them to give a professional financial opinion, planning opinion, and make that public. And you need to have elected officials that will back them and let them know that that's what is expected of them, is to give their professional opinion and recommendation, and not gear it towards what they think what you want the answer to be, or what they're being told, possibly by elected officials, the answer to be. So that's I guess the best I could answer that. I think that's been our job as electeds, is to make sure that we have people of higher integrity that will give their professional opinion, and willing to be fired over it even if they think it will be.
I think a byproduct of the economic system we have created, this very hyper-efficient system, the byproduct of it for local government is that our staff tends to orient themselves up the government food chain. We take our cues from the state government. We take our cues from the federal government. We start with, what can I get a grant for? As opposed to, what's the need at the block level? What's the desperate need in the community? What's the thing that urgently needs my attention on the ground? And that's, we can call that I would resist calling it an individual failure. I think a lot of our staff people are frustrated with this system, but I think it's endemic to the system we created, that our livelihood as a community next year is more dependent on what happens in Sacramento than what happens on the block in Anaheim. And that's backward, that's upside down.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to hear your opinion. This is a wonderful forum, by the way. Thank you for all being here. In my opinion, the problem with the Disney deal and every deal that Tom mentioned, there was no tat for the tit. Tit for tat. There was no balance. One side got all the gravy, the other side went home hungry. What did Anaheim get that was tangible at that time, in real time? Answer, nothing. That's the problem with being imbalanced. What I want to ask you about then, given that, what do you guys think of fair business deals where everybody wins? Tell me an example of one that you've seen that works, where a corporation is benevolent and they make a deal with the city, and all boats rise. Can you give us some positive examples of sort of anti-cronyism or something that really worked? I can give you one about my business, but that's not why I'm here. What have you guys seen in the country?
Let me give you one that's a little, it's not tax subsidies, it's regulation, and it's probably going to distribute you even more because of that. And I want to use it as an example because I like it. I was working with a community where there was no movie theater, and someone wanted to start. It was kind of enough to maybe have a movie theater, but didn't have one. It was kind of remote to where there wasn't like a one really close. So like this was a business model that made sense. But the people who came forward and wanted to do it were kind of, they were local. They weren't, Cinema 16, whatever, tied in the band chain. I don't know what the deal is. They were not a franchise. They were just going to do something local. But, you could get distributors and show movies. And they were going to do, top run movies, the stuff that was out. But they were going to have a small, like 6-screen theater. And what they said is that if we do this, if we invest our limited equity, if we put our sweat and toil into this thing, and next year the big theater comes in and opens up the street, we're going to lose everything. So we can't do this unless you will change your ordinance to essentially, and they had to do it in kind of a funky way, but they said like you can't have a theater within so many miles of like another theater, and it basically made it so that there could never be another theater in town. They basically gave this theater a monopoly to operate. And I looked at that, and it violated like my free market principles. It's like, why would government come in and do this? Why would you, does this make sense? I don't really like it. It doesn't fit right with me. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, like, is there another way? Is there another way? Because the town wasn't big enough for 2 theaters. If they had opened up and then the big, chain theater decided they're going to have 1 or 2 and they came in, they could have driven the first one out of business without really much effort. And they would have lost everything. And in the absence of it, they would not have had any theater at all. So like this actually got the ball rolling. And I think, after a certain amount of time, maybe you change that code and go back. But at the end of the day, I was kind of comfortable with it as a short-term measure to kind of get things off the ground and get things moving. I think you would call that at its essence like cronyism, right? They came in, they made a case to their buddies on the council and their friends in the community that, hey, we're here in the community, we're vested, help us out, protect us from competition, and we'll provide this theater. It's work.
Tom, what was your thought on that?
Well, my initial thought was Bill Taramina asked a question, and this is actually his building that he built.
This one here?
Yeah, this building
Oh,
right
it's a
here.
gorgeous
This is
building.
Gorgeous building. But, so we have, years ago, the city entered into a trash contract, and it is Bill's family, his father. And there was a sense that they needed an efficient way to, pick up the trash and move it to a dump site and all that stuff. So a franchise was given to Taramina Industries. Seemed to have worked really well over the year. And and is checked by other trash haulers and things like that. I guess by within a reasonable price and things like that. We do franchises with cable companies, things that and certainly there's all sorts of businesses, and I don't know if you call them public-private partnerships or what, but we have to deliver a lot of services, and a lot of services that cannot be delivered by the people, the employees. There's security and things like that. So we buy vehicles and we enter contracts with people making our fire trucks and all these different type of things. So there is a need, in fact, a desperate need. Well, not desperate, but we have to do business with the private sector to deliver services. And I think what Bill is talking about on these deals, we don't really have a need to. I mean, at the very least, I guess we don't need to invest in a hotel. We have 20,000 hotel rooms here already. And we certainly don't have a need to basically give money to a hotelier with no, I suppose that there's a different level of cronyism where we might have invested that money and got a return, but we didn't even get a return on that stuff. So there's certainly are deals that that make sense, but I think, again, Andrew Jackson, a prudent system of expenditures. And if it's transparent and if it's open to all and people bid on it, things like that, then then you'll get a much better deal for the people.
Well, Tom, I have to say that I think Chuck's example, movie theater, here, Crony, most still form. And if you sort of think about it, okay, fine, this government decided to give these people who want to create a movie theater, very laudable, a monopoly in their town. So what does that say about their policy? Somebody else comes forward. And of course, we know that probably that town gives all kinds of monopolies in terms of licensing requirements, barbers, musicians, other people might want to come in and do business there too, but can't. So that interrupts the free market, and I think that's what we're talking about. I see that we have no other.
Can I make a comment on that?
Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
Here's I think the catch with this, and it goes with your garbage example too, as well as my theater. Both of these are essentially local people that we look in the eye. And this is what I was getting at with my comment earlier on the social pressure. I think if this city, obviously granting a monopoly through the zoning code is not a permanent thing. The city could decide tomorrow after the theater is built to change that. So there's in a sense, social contract between the owners of this theater and the city that this will continue. And, okay, what if the owner of the theater now makes tons of money, moves out of town, builds a big house, flaunts their wealth, doesn't reinvest in the community, and then, someone comes to town with a rival theater? That social bond is gone. It's deteriorated, it's different. But what if the person who owns the theater does like a really diligent job of it, highlights local people, lets people rent out, at cheap price, for public service, nonprofits at the local level, does things as active in the community, has a float in the 4th of July parade, volunteers on the PTA. You see what I'm saying? Like creates these social bonds. All of a sudden, that trade-off is a price paid that the community is willing to pay. And that's what I'm saying. It's different than the Disney Corporation getting a subsidy from Anaheim, because that's like 8 steps removed from me. The shareholders are somewhere else. The ownership is somewhere else. The decision is made somewhere else. The garbage contract is very different because we see the guy. He's sitting right there. We know him. There's a certain amount of accountability. If things don't work out right personally, there's going to be a certain pressure to change that deal, and you have that power to do it. And that's what I'm talking about, the difference between cronyism in an age where decisions are local and there's like an underlying kind of social enforcement of them, and with cronyism when it's centralized, and essentially we can just see it and be disgusted by it, but there's nothing we can really do about it.
Well, Chuck, I have the last word. We are at the end of our time. I want to thank everybody for coming very, very much.